She had never fired a rifle before October. She had never touched a horse before September. But on a moonless night in February, with her husband bleeding in the snow and armed men circling the barn, Verity Stone picked up the Winchester above the fireplace, aimed through the kitchen window, and pulled the trigger. She missed by 6 feet, and 6 feet was close enough. But this story does not begin with a gunshot in the dark. It begins with a dust cloud on an eastern road, a man with a secret, in 6 words that changed everything. The dust cloud rising from the eastern road caught Garrett Stone's attention the way fire catches a man who has been waiting for warmth his whole life. He stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the general store in Fort Benton, Montana Territory. A 50-pound sack of flour balanced on one shoulder, his hat pulled low against the September sun. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man with nothing particular on his mind, a rancher running errands, a bachelor picking up supplies. But his eyes kept drifting eastward, to the road that wound down from the mountains and stretched all the way back to a world he had never seen, a world of cobblestone streets and gas lamps and universities, a world called Philadelphia. He had not told his brothers. That was the thought that sat heaviest in his chest as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the dusty street of Fort Benton. Not the nervousness about meeting a woman he had only known through letters, not the uncertainty about whether she would find him acceptable, whether his rough hands and sun-weathered face would measure up against whatever picture she had formed in her mind. Those fears were manageable. What gnawed at him was the secret. Garrett Stone, who had built his entire life on honesty and straight dealing, had kept a secret from the 2 people he loved most in this world. And the weight of that secret pressed on him now. Like the flour sack on his shoulder, only heavier because flour does not judge you when you set it down. He was 34 years old. For the past 10 years since their father Duncan was shot dead on a road 5 miles from where Garrett now stood, he had been everything to his younger brothers. Father and mother both. Foreman and counselor. The steady hand on the wheel when storms hit, when cattle died, when the loneliness of their mountain ranch grew so thick you could choke on it. Beckett was 30 now, fierce and wounded and burning with an anger that never fully banked. His amber eyes carried a heat you could feel from 10 feet away, and his fists had settled more arguments than his words ever managed. 2 years ago, a woman named Rosalie Voss had walked into his life with warm smiles and gentle lies. She had been beautiful and attentive and everything a lonely man on a remote ranch could want. And she had been sent by Victor Hargrove, the wealthy rancher who owned the property east of the Stones' land, to spy on the family and gather information about their holdings. Beckett had opened his heart for the first time since his mother's death, and Rosalie had walked through it like a thief through an unlocked door, taking what she needed and leaving wreckage behind. Since then, Beckett trusted nothing and no one outside his brother's blood. Tucker was 27, gentle, artistic, haunted by the memory of finding their father's body on that road when he was just 17 years old. He was the tallest of the 3 at 6'5", with dark blonde hair that caught golden light and amber green eyes that held a warmth his middle brother lacked entirely. He carved wooden figures by lantern light when sleep would not come. He read poetry in secret. He moved through the world with the quiet care of a man who had spent years handling newborn animals and shaping delicate woodwork with hands large enough to palm a man's skull. Garrett held them together. That was his purpose. That was his identity. And he had made a decision about their shared life without consulting either of them. The advertisement had been placed on a winter night 6 months ago. January. The kind of Montana night when the cold goes past your bones and settles into your soul, when the wind screams down from the Bitterroot Peaks like something grieving, and the silence inside the house is louder than the storm outside. Garrett had been sitting alone at the kitchen table. The lamp burned low. The fire was dying in the hearth that his father had built with his own hands 20 years before. Beckett was out checking the herd. Tucker was in the barn, probably carving by lantern light, as he always did when sleep would not come. And Garrett had looked around that empty room and felt something crack inside his chest. Not a dramatic break, something quieter, the slow giving way of a man who had been holding too much for too long. He told himself it was practical. The ranch needed a woman's touch. The house needed warmth beyond what a fireplace could provide. The Stone name needed to continue. It needed children and laughter and the sound of something other than 3 grown men eating in silence and then going to their separate rooms. But the truth was simpler than all of that. He was tired of being alone. The letters from Verity Ashford had been a revelation. She wrote with a precision that spoke of education and a warmth that spoke of genuine feeling. She described her life as a teacher at a charity school in Philadelphia, her love of books and learning, her belief that knowledge could lift people out of any circumstance. She was honest about her situation. The school had closed when its benefactor died. Her savings were gone. She needed a new beginning. What she had not mentioned was her mother. And what Garrett had not mentioned was that he was one of three. Before we go on, if you are new here, hit subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week. And drop a comment below. Where are you listening from tonight now? Back to our story. The dust cloud grew larger. The distant sound of horses and wheels resolved into the familiar rattle of the westbound stagecoach, and Garrett's heart began to hammer with a force that had nothing to do with physical labor. He set the flour sack down by the general store's door and crossed the street in long strides, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. The stagecoach came clattering into Fort Benton with the usual commotion. The driver hauled on the brake. The horses snorted and stamped. Passengers who had been jostled for days shifted in their seats, and the coach rocked on its leather springs before settling with a groan in front of the modest hotel that served as the town's gathering point. Garrett positioned himself near the coach door, removed his hat, and waited. A gloved hand appeared first, small, delicate, reaching for the doorframe with the careful precision of someone who has learned to move gracefully through a world that offers no guarantees. Then the hand was followed by a woman, and Garrett, stone, forgot how to breathe. Verity Grace Ashford stepped down from the stagecoach and into the September light of Fort Benton, Montana territory. She was smaller than he had imagined, barely reaching his chest. Her honey blonde hair was partially pinned up in a modest arrangement that was losing its battle against the rigors of cross-country travel. Soft tendrils escaped around her face and temples, catching the golden afternoon sun in a way that made them glow. Her face was heart-shaped, her features delicate, high cheekbones and a small, straight nose and full lips pressed together in an expression of tightly controlled composure. She wore a traveling dress of navy blue, fitted and tasteful, with small lace details at the collar and cuffs. The fabric showed the dust and wear of days on the road, but it maintained an air of dignity that no amount of trail dust could erase. But it was her eyes that struck him, cornflower blue, large and expressive, fringed with dark lashes. And in those eyes, Garrett saw something he recognized from his own mirror on hard mornings. Intelligence warring with exhaustion, hope wrestling with fear. The look of a person who has bet everything on a single throw and is waiting to see where the dice land. She was not beautiful in the way of magazine illustrations. She was beautiful in the way of real things, living things. The way a mountain meadow is beautiful after a hard winter when the first wildflowers push through the snow and declare that they will not be defeated. Then the world shifted under his feet. A second figure emerged from the coach, and everything Garrett thought he understood about this arrangement changed in the span of a heartbeat. An elderly woman took Verity's offered hand and descended the coach steps with painful slowness. She was thin and frail, with silver hair pulled back from a face mapped with the lines of 63 years of living. Her eyes were faded blue, but sharp as cut glass, taking in her surroundings with an alertness that contradicted her physical fragility. Her lips had a slight bluish tint that Garrett recognized immediately. He had seen it on calves born too early, on hands exposed too long to winter cold. It was the color of a heart that could not pump enough blood, could not push enough life through the body that depended on it. Verity positioned herself beside the older woman with a protectiveness that was instinctive and absolute, one hand on her mother's elbow, the other ready to catch her if she stumbled. "Mama, careful now," Verity said softly. Her voice carried across the street, despite its gentleness, and it was the first time Garrett heard her speak. The sound of it settled somewhere deep in his chest and stayed there. "We are here, we made it." The letters had never mentioned a mother. Garrett processed this in 3 heartbeats. First heartbeat, she lied to me. Second heartbeat, no, she omitted, the way I omitted my brothers. Third heartbeat, it does not matter. Look at them. 2 women standing on a boardwalk in a town they had never visited, carrying everything they owned in 2 worn carpet bags and a trunk that could not have weighed more than 30 pounds. They had no one. They were alone in the world. And they had come all this way on the strength of letters from a stranger. Sometimes life does not give you good choices. It only gives you the brave one. The station manager, a round man named Clyde, who had opinions about everything and the discretion to share none of them, was already approaching the women. Garrett could not hear the exchange, but he could read bodies the way any rancher reads weather. Verity's shoulders went rigid, her chin lifted in that gesture of defensive pride that people make when they know bad news is coming and refuse to be diminished by it. Clyde was shaking his head. The hotel was full, or he doubted their ability to pay, or both. Garrett crossed the remaining distance in 4 strides. "Excuse me," he said, and both women turned to look at him. Up close, Verity's eyes were even more remarkable. Cornflower blue with darker rings around the iris. Wide and watchful and bright with tears, she was clearly fighting to contain. She studied him with an assessing gaze that held both hope and weariness, and Garrett found himself standing straighter, wanting to be worthy of whatever she saw. "Miss Ashford, I am Garrett Stone." Recognition flooded her face, followed by something more complex. Relief and anxiety, and the particular vulnerability of meeting someone who holds power over your future. "Yes," she said. "I am Verity Ashford. Are you Mr. Stone?" He nodded, then turned to the elderly woman. "And you must be Mrs. Ashford. I am pleased to meet you both." Harriet Ashford fixed him with those faded blue eyes that missed nothing. "Harriet Ashford," she said, her voice thin but steady as a church bell. "I apologize for the surprise, Mr. Stone. Verity wrote to tell you about me, but I suppose the letter did not arrive before we had to leave Philadelphia." Had to leave, not chose to leave. Had to. Garrett filed that away. Whatever had driven their departure was urgent enough that they could not wait for a reply that never came. Desperation made people vulnerable, and something inside Garrett Stone, something that had been shaped by watching his mother care for neighbors in need, and by hearing a father who believed that a man's worth was measured by how he treated those weaker than himself, that something rose up and made the decision before his conscious mind could weigh the cost. "No letter arrived," he said, keeping his voice steady and kind, the same tone he used with spooked horses and frightened cattle. "But that does not change anything important. Our home has room for both of you if you are still willing to consider the arrangement we discussed." Our home has room for both. The first time he spoke those words, not the last. The relief that washed over Verity's face was so profound, so naked, that Garrett felt his own eyes sting. She had been braced for rejection. She had probably rehearsed a dozen speeches on that long stagecoach ride, arguments for why her mother should be accepted, promises of extra labor and minimal burden. The fact that he had not hesitated, had not even paused, had stripped away every rehearsed word and left her standing in raw emotion. "You mean that?" she asked, and there was a tremor in her voice that she could not hide despite her obvious effort. "We would not be an imposition. I can work, Mr. Stone. I can cook and clean and do whatever needs doing. Mama can mend. She was the finest seamstress in Philadelphia. We will earn our keep. I promise you that. I am sure you will both be valuable additions to the household," Garrett said. "But first, let us get you settled and fed. You must be exhausted from the journey." He collected their bags before either woman could protest. 2 carpet bags and a small trunk. He lifted them all with one arm. Everything they owned in the world weighed less than a bale of hay. But the weight of their trust in him, a stranger whose face they had never seen before this afternoon, that settled over Garrett's shoulders with a gravity that no physical burden could match. A man keeps his word. That was what Duncan Stone had taught his boys, and Garrett had just given his. The road from Fort Benton to the Stone Ranch climbed gradually into the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains, winding through stands of lodgepole pine and past meadows still golden with late-season grass. The landscape transformed with each mile. The flat, dusty openness of the town gave way to something grander and wilder. Granite outcroppings rose from the hillsides like the bones of the earth itself. Streams ran clear as glass over beds of smooth stone. And above it all, the Bitterroot Peaks stood in a wall of stone and snow, their summits catching the afternoon light in shades of orange and gold that seemed too vivid to be real. Garrett talked as he drove, keeping his voice low and steady, explaining the landscape and the climate and the challenges of ranching in mountain country. He was not normally a talkative man. Words cost him effort in a way that physical labor never did. But he understood that these women needed to hear his voice. needed the reassurance of ordinary conversation to anchor them in this extraordinary situation. He talked about the soil, clay, heavy in the valley bottoms, sandy and light on the hillsides. About the seasons, spring came short and violent summer burned hot and dry autumn turned the whole world gold, and winter could kill a man in minutes if he stepped outside unprepared. About the herd, 200 head, mostly Hereford, moving between the low pastures in winter and the high meadows in summer. About the water, two creeks that converged at the ranch, ensuring year-round supply even in the driest summers. These were the things a man talked about when he knew his land. And Garrett Stone knew this land the way he knew his own hands. During the ride, he learned pieces of their story. Harriet's husband, Thomas, had been a professor and scholar, a man whose radical ideas about educating women and the poor had cost him his position at the university and eventually his reputation. He died 15 years ago in an accident at the Philadelphia docks, crushed when a crane collapsed while he was helping unload donated books for a charity school. Verity had been 7 years old. Harriet had supported them through her sewing, 30 years of needlework building a reputation as the finest seamstress in their neighborhood. But her heart had been weakening for years, and the smoke and filth of the city made everything worse. When Verity's teaching position ended when the charity school closed, with only a week's notice, the last pillar holding their lives upright had been knocked away. "I saw your advertisement in a newspaper someone had left at the boarding house." Verity said, her voice careful and measured, as if she were narrating someone else's life rather than her own. It seemed like a chance for both of us to begin again. Harriet had been watching the mountains during this conversation with an intensity that went beyond a newcomer's curiosity. Her faded blue eyes swept across the ridge lines and the valleys below, with a focus that made Garrett glance at her twice. It was not awe he saw on her face. It was recognition. "I like this land," Harriet said, her thin voice carrying unexpected conviction. "Thomas would have loved it here. He always said Montana was the most beautiful place God ever made." The specificity of the statement caught Garrett's attention. A Philadelphia professor with opinions about Montana. That was unusual enough to notice. But before he could ask, Harriet continued. "He came out west once, you know, years before we married. In 1855, he never stopped talking about these mountains, said they reminded him of cathedrals." Something flickered in her expression then. Not just nostalgia, something purposeful, something she was keeping close. The way you keep a card against your chest when the stakes are high and the game is far from over. Garrett watched her from the corner of his eye and wondered what Harriet Ashford was carrying in that battered trunk besides clothing and memories. But that question would have to wait, because the wagon crested the final rise and the stone ranch spread out below them in the golden light of late afternoon. It was not a small operation. The main house was a large log structure that Duncan Stone had begun 20 years ago, and his sons had expanded steadily in the decades since his death. It had a covered porch wrapping around three sides, a stone chimney that rose above the roofline, and glass windows that caught the sun and threw it back in bright flashes. Beyond the house stood a substantial barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, a root cellar, dug into the hillside corrals for horses, and a bunkhouse for seasonal hands. The whole property sat in a high valley where two creeks converged, with pastures stretching out in three directions, and the Bitterroot Peaks standing guard behind it all, like the walls of a fortress. "Home," Garrett said simply. And there on the porch, two figures stood watching the wagon approach. Even from 100 yards, Verity could see that they were enormous. As tall as Garrett or close to it, with the same broad shoulders and the same hard set to their jaws. They stood with their arms crossed, and their postures ranged from open curiosity to something much closer to hostility. The silence in the wagon became very heavy. Verity turned to Garrett. He could see the realization forming in her cornflower blue eyes, the understanding that he had kept his own secret just as she had kept hers. "Mr. Stone," she said, and her voice had gone quiet in a way that was more alarming than any shout. "Your letters mentioned that you had family. You did not mention that your family would be quite so present." "My brothers," Garrett said. He felt the weight of his omission like a stone in his chest. "Beckett and Tucker. They live here. We run the ranch together." Harriet placed a hand on Verity's arm. Whether to steady her or restrain her was unclear. "You might have mentioned that," Verity said. "You might have mentioned your mother," Garrett replied. A beat of silence. Then another. The horses plodded forward. The porch grew closer. And then Verity Grace Ashford, 22-year-old schoolteacher from Philadelphia orphan, and caretaker and woman who had gambled her entire life on a newspaper advertisement, did something that Garrett Stone would remember for the rest of his days. She laughed. Not a polite laugh or a nervous laugh. A real one, startled out of her by the sheer absurdity of their situation. Two people who had come together through carefully worded letters, each concealing the one thing they feared would ruin the arrangement, now confronted with each other's secrets simultaneously. "It seems," Verity said, and her eyes were warm with a light that had not been there before, "that we both have some explaining to do." "It seems we do," Garrett agreed. And despite everything, despite the brothers waiting on the porch and the reckoning that was coming, and the uncertain future stretching out before all of them, he felt something loosen in his chest. Because a woman who could laugh at a moment like this was a woman who might just be strong enough for everything that Montana was about to throw at her. The wagon stopped in front of the porch. Beckett Stone came down the steps like a storm rolling off the mountains. He was 30 years old, slightly shorter than Garrett, but broader through the shoulders, with light auburn brown hair that fell across his forehead and amber eyes that burned with a heat you could feel from 10 feet away. Everything about him radiated coiled energy and barely contained fury. "What is this?" Beckett said, his voice a low growl that he aimed at Garrett, but that carried clearly to every ear present. He looked from Verity to Harriet, to the bags in the wagon bed, and back to his brother. "What is this, Garrett?" "This is Miss Verity Ashford, and her mother, Mrs. Harriet Ashford. Miss Ashford has traveled from Philadelphia to discuss an arrangement I offered through correspondence." Correspondence. The word came out flat as a blade. "A mail-order bride. You sent for a mail-order bride without telling us." "I did." Garrett kept his voice level. "And she brought her mother." Beckett looked at Harriet, and despite everything burning inside him, something shifted when he saw her. The thin silver hair, the blue-tinged lips, the way she leaned against her daughter as if gravity had become her enemy. Harriet Ashford was nobody's threat. She was somebody's grandmother, frail and exhausted, and very far from home. Even Beckett Stone's battered sense of compassion could not pretend otherwise. Her mother, who was clearly not well. "She is not," Garrett confirmed, "and they have both traveled a very long way. So whatever you need to say to me, and I can see you have a considerable amount, you will say it later. Right now, they need rest and food and the kind of welcome that our mother raised us to give." The mention of Eleanor Stone was surgical. Their mother had been a woman whose principles were forged in the same Scottish iron that ran through her blood, and the first among those principles was that you never turned away a person in need. You never closed your door to someone standing on your porch with nowhere else to go. Not in a blizzard, not in a drought, not ever. The name settled over Beckett like a hand on his shoulder, steadying him against his will. His jaw clenched hard enough to crack walnuts, but he stepped aside. Tucker had already moved. The youngest Stone brother came forward with a gentleness that seemed impossible in someone his size. 6'5" of muscle and bone, with dark blonde hair that caught the golden light and amber green eyes that held a warmth his middle brother lacked entirely. He moved the way he did everything, with the quiet care of a man who had spent years handling newborn animals and shaping delicate woodwork with hands large enough to palm a man's skull. He offered Harriet his arm without a word of introduction or explanation. "Ma'am," he said, his deep voice soft as lamb's wool, "let me help you inside. There is a chair by the fire, and I will get the kettle going." Harriet looked up at this enormous young man who was offering to make her tea with the same earnest attention most men reserve for matters of commerce and war. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. Harriet had lost a son in infancy years before Verity was born. Tucker had lost a mother who would have been Harriet's age if she had lived. Neither knew the other's loss, but recognition does not always require explanation. "Thank you, young man," Harriet said, and her voice quavered with a gratitude that she was too tired to disguise. "You remind me of my Thomas. He was big like you and gentle with it." Tucker blinked. Something moved behind his eyes. Then he guided Harriet up the porch steps with infinite care, his massive arm, her shield against gravity and exhaustion, and all the miles she had traveled to reach this place. "This mountain chose you," Tucker would tell Verity weeks later, about something else entirely. But looking back, Garrett thought the mountain might have started choosing that first afternoon when the youngest Stone brother offered his arm to a dying woman from Philadelphia and she took it. Inside, the stone house revealed itself as a domain of men living without feminine influence. It was clean enough, mostly Tucker's doing, but it was bare in ways that told a story. No curtains softened the windows. No rugs warmed the plank floors. No photographs or decorations or flowers or any of the small touches that transform a structure of wood and stone into something worth coming home to. The furnishings were hand-built and sturdy. The kitchen had a proper iron stove that had been Eleanor Stone's pride, ordered from St. Louis and freighted 500 miles by ox cart over mountain roads. It was the most expensive thing in the house, and the brothers treated it with the reverent caution of men who understood its value but had never fully mastered its temperament. 4 bedrooms branched off a short hallway. Everything was functional. Nothing was beautiful. Garrett gave Verity Carrington Harriet the bedroom that had belonged to his parents. The largest room, the best mattress, the window that faced the mountains. Beckett objected with his jaw and his eyes, but not his voice. This was their parents' room, their mother's room. The ghost of lavender soap still lingered in the wood if you pressed your face close enough. "It is the most comfortable room," Garrett said, meeting his brother's silent fury with the steady authority of a decade of leadership. "Mrs. Ashford needs proper rest. Mama would have wanted it. Mama would have wanted it." 5 words that ended arguments the way a key ends a lock. Click, and the door either opens or stays shut, and there is no middle ground. The first evening unfolded with the careful choreography of strangers learning to share space. Garrett prepared stew while Verity helped with an efficiency that transformed the kitchen's operations. Within 30 minutes, she had reorganized the spice shelf and asked intelligent questions about storage and produced from the same basic ingredients a meal that was markedly better than anything the brothers had managed in 10 years of bachelor cooking. "What is this?" Tucker asked, staring at his bowl with the expression of a man who has just discovered a new continent. "Stew?" Verity said. "No," Tucker replied slowly. "I have eaten stew. This is something else. This is stew that actually wants to be eaten." Garrett looked at his own bowl, then at the identical stew they had been making for a decade, then at Verity, who was watching the brothers with the faintest trace of a smile that suggested she knew exactly how bad their cooking had been and was too polite to say so directly. "Is that oregano?" Garrett asked. "Oregano, a bay leaf, and the radical concept of seasoning meat before you cook it," Verity replied. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. The roast buried inside it was surgical. Even Beckett ate a second helping, though he would have denied it under oath. Tucker tended to Harriet with a devotion that went beyond courtesy. He positioned her chair at the optimal distance from the fire, not so close that the heat would be oppressive, not so far that she would feel the draft from the windows. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders before she could shiver. He served her tea in the least chipped cup in the household, which was not saying much, but the gesture mattered more than the vessel. Beckett sat in the far corner cleaning his rifle with an aggression that turned the mundane task into a statement of protest. He ate quickly, spoke to no one, and watched everything with the intensity of a man cataloging evidence for a trial. Every gesture Verity made, every word Harriet spoke, he examined for deception. Because Rosalie Voss had taught him that warmth could be a weapon and kindness could be a lie. And the lesson had burned so deep that 2 years later, the scar tissue still would not let him bend. Harriet proved to be the unexpected architect of the evening's conversation. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she engaged Tucker with questions about the house. Who had built the fireplace their father Duncan 20 years ago? Who carved the mantelpiece? Tucker himself in the admission brought a blush to his weathered cheeks that was visible even in the lamplight. Was the kitchen garden productive? It was not. Growing things had been Eleanor's province, and her sons had not inherited the gift. The garden had been slowly surrendering to weeds for a decade, producing nothing but guilt. "My Thomas could grow anything," Harriet said. "He always told me the soil needed to be spoken to. I thought he was foolish until I saw his tomatoes." She paused and something moved behind her eyes, something deliberate. "He traveled out west once years before we married, 1855. He never stopped talking about Montana. Said the mountains were like standing inside a cathedral that God built for himself." A Philadelphia professor who had been to Montana in 1855 and never stopped talking about it. A woman who looked at the Bitterroot Mountains not with awe but with recognition. A trunk with a false bottom that Harriet had carried across 2,000 miles. Garrett noticed all of this. He did not understand any of it. Not yet. Later, when the women had retired and the house had settled into the particular silence that follows the departure of guests, the three Stone brothers convened on the front porch for the reckoning that had been building since the wagon pulled up. The night was clear and bitterly cold. Stars blazed across the Montana sky in numbers that no city dweller could imagine. The Milky Way arched overhead like a river of light poured across the darkness. In the distance, wolves howled on the far ridge, their voices ancient and thin, carrying across the valley like prayers in a language older than words. Beckett did not waste time. You had no right. His voice was low and hard. This ranch belongs to all three of us equally. Pa left it to all three of us. You do not get to make decisions like this on your own. I placed an advertisement, Garrett replied, his voice measured. I answered letters. I invited a woman to discuss an arrangement. I did not sell the ranch or give away anyone's share. You brought a strange woman into our home. Two strange women, without a word to either of us. Beckett's voice was tight as barbed wire. What if she is another Rosalie? The name landed like a slap in the cold air. Tucker flinched. Garrett held steady. She is nothing like Rosalie. Rosalie was sent by Hargrove to spy on us. Verity is a school teacher who answered a newspaper advertisement because she and her dying mother had nowhere else to turn. There is a difference, Beckett, and you know it. I know nothing about her. Neither do you. Letters are easy to fake. And what is the alternative? Garrett stepped closer to his brother. Not aggressive, but immovable. The way a mountain is immovable. We live here alone for the rest of our lives, three brothers growing old in silence, watching the ranch our father built become an empty monument to stubbornness. Pa wanted grandchildren. Mama wanted us to build families. This ranch needs life in it, Beckett, not just labor. The silence that followed was filled with 10 years of unspoken grief, 10 years of three men eating dinner without speaking, 10 years of birthdays unmarked and holidays endured, and the slow grinding loneliness that eats a man from the inside the way rust eats iron, quietly, relentlessly. Until one morning you look in the mirror and realize there is nothing left but the shell. Tucker spoke then. His quiet voice cut through the argument the way a sharp blade cuts through rope, clean and final. Her hands were shaking. Both brothers turned to look at him. Tucker was leaning against the porch rail, his massive frame silhouetted against the stars, his amber-green eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside the house. At dinner, Tucker continued, her hands were shaking the whole time. She was terrified, but she sat at that table with three men she had never met, in a house she had never seen, in a territory she had never visited. And she did not run. She did not cry. She sat with her back straight and her chin up and made conversation as if her life depended on it. He paused. The wolves had stopped howling. The night held its breath. That is not a woman who is scheming, Beckett. That is a woman who is surviving. The silence that followed Tucker's words was the kind that rearranges things inside a man, whether he wants it to or not. The kind that slips past every wall and every scar and finds the place where the truth lives, even when the truth is something you are not ready to hear. I will not turn them away, Garrett said, and his voice carried the weight of bedrock. The weight of 10 years of holding this family together through blizzards and drought and grief and the slow erosion of hope. If you cannot accept that you are welcome to sleep in the bunkhouse until you can, but they stay, that is not something I am willing to negotiate. That is not something I am willing to negotiate. He would say this again months later under circumstances far more dangerous than a disagreement on a porch. And the words would carry the same weight both times. Beckett stared at his brother for a long, charged moment. The air between them hummed with everything they could not say. Then he turned and walked off the porch into the darkness, and his boots crunching on frost-hardened ground, his broad shoulders disappearing toward the barn. Tucker watched him go. He will come around. He is not angry at you. He is not even angry at her. He is angry at himself for being afraid. I know, Garrett said wearily. And Garrett, Tucker straightened from the rail. Harriet is the bravest woman I have ever met. She is dying. You can see it in the color of her lips and the way she fights for every breath. But she got on a stagecoach and traveled 2,000 miles because she believed her daughter deserved a chance at happiness. That is not something a bad person does. That is something a hero does. Garrett placed his hand on his youngest brother's shoulder and squeezed. Neither of them spoke again. they did not need to. Some things between brothers go deeper than language, deeper than gesture down to the bedrock, where the foundation of a family either holds or it does not. The first week at the Stone Ranch unfolded as a careful negotiation between very different people learning to occupy the same space. Verity rose before dawn each morning at 4:30, when the sky was just beginning to shift from black to blue-gray, and took over the kitchen with a methodical competence that gradually transformed the brothers' joyless meals into something that nourished more than just the body. She learned the temperament of the iron stove. Eleanor Stone's stove, ordered from St. Louis and freighted 500 miles, had a personality as distinctive as any horse in the barn. You had to feed the coal at the right moment. Too early and the fire died. Too late and the heat came uneven. You had to adjust the front vent half open when baking bread, 2/3 closed when simmering stew. You had to know its sounds. A soft ticking meant the metal was expanding evenly. A sharp click meant the grate inside had shifted and needed adjusting. Verity mastered all of it within 5 days. She reorganized the pantry, which was a feat of engineering given what she had to work with. The three Stone brothers stored food according to a system that Verity could only describe as, whatever touches your hand first gets shoved wherever there is space. Flour next to tobacco, salt next to ammunition, sugar in a tin labeled blasting caps that Verity checked 3 times before daring to open did in fact contain only sugar, but the label nearly gave her heart failure. She created a rotation for dry goods sorted by use and expiration. She discovered that the three Stone brothers owned 27 cans of beans and exactly 0 cans of any other vegetable. She made a shopping list for the next trip to Fort Benton that ran 3 pages long, and when Garrett looked at it, he discovered he did not know what half the items were. "What is oregano?" he asked, tilting his head at the list with the expression of a man reading a map of foreign territory. "It is a herb that helps stew not taste like boot leather." "Mr. Stone," Verity replied in the teacher's voice she used when children asked why they had to learn multiplication tables. Garrett looked at her, then at the bowl of stew he had eaten the night before, then back at her. "My stew does not taste like boot leather," he said, but the conviction was noticeably absent. "Mr. Stone, with all due respect, your stew tastes exactly like boot leather. Boot leather that someone has simmered in salt water for 6 hours." From the dinner table, Tucker choked on his coffee. Harriet established her domain with the authority of a woman who had been running things since before any of the brothers were born. Within 3 days, she had assessed every garment in the house and declared a sewing emergency. Garrett's shirts had more patches than original fabric. Tucker's trousers were torn at the left knee, and he had repaired them with a piece of cowhide that created an aesthetic effect Harriet described as interesting but unacceptable. Beckett owned exactly 1 intact jacket, and intact here meant does not yet have a hole large enough to fit a fist through. Her gnarled hands, weakened by illness, but strengthened by 30 years of muscle memory, moved over fabric with the sureness of a master. She did not just patch, she restored. Her stitches were so small and even, they were invisible to the naked eye unless you knew where to look. She reinforced elbows with double fabric. She replaced buttons with brass ones she salvaged from a shirt beyond saving. When she finished, the Stone brothers' clothing looked as though it belonged to men who knew there was a woman in the house. Tucker gravitated toward Harriet the way water finds its level. He sat with her while she sewed, telling stories about the ranch and the mountains and the animals he had known. In return, Harriet told him about Philadelphia, about concerts and bookshops and the husband she had loved for too few years. "Thomas was like you," Harriet said one afternoon, "big and gentle. Everyone underestimated him because of his size. They did not know he could quote Wordsworth from memory." Tucker turned red. "I read some, not Wordsworth, but I have a book of poems, Walt Whitman." Harriet's face illuminated. "Whitman Thomas loved Whitman. I contain multitudes." That was his favorite line. They sat together in the afternoon light, the old woman and the young giant connected by a dead poet, in the particular loneliness of people who feel things too deeply for the world they inhabit. Beckett maintained his distance. He was civil in the barest definition of the word. He ate with mechanical efficiency and retreated to the barn or the range at every opportunity. His coldness was not aggressive, but absolute. A wall of ice that Verity could feel every time she entered a room he occupied. He did not speak to her directly. He did not acknowledge her presence. He simply existed in the same space with the determined neutrality of a man who has decided that the best way to deal with a problem is to pretend it is not there. On the third day, Garrett rode to Fort Benton and returned with a sewing machine strapped to a saddle horse. He carried it into the house on his shoulder and set it before Harriet with the gruff embarrassment of a man performing a generous act he would prefer no one acknowledge. "Heard the mercantile had one collecting dust in the back," Garrett said. "Figured it would make your work easier." Harriet's eyes filled. She ran her hands over the machine's surface with the reverence of a violinist touching a Stradivarius she thought she would never play again. "I have not had access to a machine since I lost my position at the shop," she whispered. "This is too generous, Mr. Stone." "It is an investment," Garrett said with practiced practicality. "You can take in repairs from folks in town. Extra income for the household." But every person in that room understood what the sewing machine truly was. It was not an investment. It was a declaration. It said what Garrett Stone could not bring himself to say with words. "You are staying, you belong here. Your skills have value and your presence has meaning in this house. You are home now." From the doorway, unseen by the others, Beckett watched. He said nothing, but he did not leave. And something in his expression, barely visible and quickly hidden, shifted like the first crack in river ice at the end of a long winter. That crack would widen, slowly, imperceptibly. One grain of resistance at a time washing away, but not yet. Because on the 10th night after the women arrived, a thunderstorm would crash through the valley with the particular fury that Montana reserves for its most theatrical weather. Lightning would split the sky. Rain would fall in solid walls. And Verity Grace Ashford, school teacher from Philadelphia, would hear a sound from the barn that would change everything. A scream. Not a neigh, not a whinny. The unmistakable scream of a horse in severe distress. And she would run toward it, not away from it, toward it, into the storm, into the barn, into a stall where Beckett's own horse, the mare who trusted no one, was dying in a complicated labor. What happened in that barn would break something open in Beckett Stone that he had spent 2 years sealing shut. And the woman who broke it open would be the last person on earth he expected. But that is a story for the next part. The storm hit on the 10th night like something personal. Lightning turned the darkness into stuttering daylight, each flash freezing the valley in white before plunging it back into black. Rain hammered the roof with a violence that made the timbers groan and sent water streaming down the window panes in sheets so thick you could not see the barn 30 yards away. Wind bent trees that had stood for a century and sent branches cracking into the darkness like rifle shots. The cattle in the upper pasture panicked. 200 head of Herefords, spooked by lightning and driven half mad by thunder, began to run. If they scattered, it would take weeks to round them up, and some would be lost forever in the mountain ravines, where even experienced riders could not safely follow. All three brothers saddled up and rode into the storm. Verity and Harriet were alone in the house. The fire snapped and popped behind the grate. The windows rattled in their frames like teeth in a fever. Harriet slept in the big bedroom, unbothered by storms after 63 years of weathering them. Verity sat by the fire pretending to read a book she had not turned a page of in 30 minutes. She was listening to the storm and thinking about the men riding through it. About Garrett, whose quiet steadiness had become the thing she oriented herself by the way a ship orients by a lighthouse. About Tucker, whose gentleness with her mother made something ache behind her ribs every time she witnessed it. Even about Beckett, who had not spoken 10 words to her in 10 days, but who rode into a storm to save cattle without hesitation because that was what the work required, and Beckett Stone did not flinch from what was required. Then she heard the sound from the barn, not a neigh, not a whinny, a scream, the unmistakable sound of a horse in severe distress cutting through the storm with a pitch that went straight through skin and bone and lodged in the center of her chest. Verity Grace Ashford did not think. She grabbed the first coat she could find, which turned out to be Tucker's, and hung past her knees like a canvas tent, snatched a lantern from the hook by the door arm, and ran through the rain to the barn. Inside, in a stall awash with straw and blood, she found one of the mares in the grip of a complicated labor. The foal was turned wrong. Verity did not know enough about horses to understand the specifics, but she could see the mare thrashing in agony, great muscles convulsing beneath a coat dark with sweat. She could see that something was terribly, desperately wrong. The mare was Copper, Beckett's horse. the one he had raised from a yearling, the horse that would kick and bite any stranger who came near her, especially when she was in pain. The last ranch hand who tried to help during a foaling had his arm broken in two places. Verity knew nothing about foaling. She had never touched a horse before arriving in Montana 10 days ago. She was a school teacher from Philadelphia, whose most dangerous previous experience involved carrying a stack of textbooks up 4 flights of stairs and once confronting a rat in the school basement with a broom. But the mare was dying, the foal was dying. The brothers were miles away in the storm, and no one else was coming. So Verity entered the stall. She placed her small hands on the mare's sweat-soaked neck, and she began to talk. She talked the way she had talked to children on their first terrified day of school, steadily, calmly, with the absolute conviction that everything would be all right even though she was not remotely sure of it. She talked about the ranch and the mountains and the beautiful morning that would follow this storm. She talked about the foal that was coming and how strong it would be and how much its mother loved it already. She talked about courage and endurance and the stubborn refusal to give up when the world turns dark and the pain becomes more than any living creature should have to bear. She talked and talked and talked, her voice a thread of calm in the chaos, her hands gentle and constant on the mare's trembling neck. And Copper responded. Not immediately, but gradually. The thrashing subsided, the breathing steadied. The great dark head turned, and Copper looked at Verity with liquid eyes that held something beyond animal instinct. Trust. The unconditional trust of a creature that has decided for reasons that defy explanation that this stranger means safety, that this small woman with the soft voice and the steady hands will not let the darkness win. The natural process resumed. An hour later, the longest hour of Verity's life, a foal slid into the world on a rush of blood and fluid that destroyed her navy blue dress, the only good dress she owned beyond any hope of repair. When the brothers returned 2 hours later, soaked and mud-caked and exhausted from wrestling cattle in the storm, they found Verity sitting in the straw of the stall. She was covered in blood and afterbirth and tears. A healthy newborn foal slept in her lap, its tiny sides rising and falling with the peaceful breathing of something that had no idea how close it came to never breathing at all. And Copper the mare, who trusted no one, was nuzzling the back of Verity's neck with the tenderness of a mother who knows her child has been saved by a stranger's hands. Beckett stopped in the barn doorway. He stared at the scene before him. His horse, his Copper, the mare who had broken the arm of the last ranch hand who tried to help during a foaling. Copper who kicked and bit and screamed at anyone who was not Beckett. Copper was letting the small Philadelphia woman hold her foal. Copper was nuzzling her. That mare, Beckett said slowly, his voice rough with something that was not anger, something he did not have a name for and was not sure he wanted one. She does not let strangers near her when she is hurting. Verity looked up at him. Her hair had come completely undone and hung in wet tangles around a face streaked with blood and tears. Her ruined dress was soaked through. She looked nothing like the composed young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 10 days ago. She looked like someone who had gone through a fire and come out the other side carrying something precious. I suppose she decided I was not a stranger, Verity said. Beckett said nothing more. He walked into the stall, knelt beside Copper, and examined the foal with practiced hands. Healthy, strong, perfectly delivered by a woman who had never touched a horse before in her life. He looked at Verity again, and what he saw made something fundamental shift behind his amber eyes. Not warmth, not yet. Something harder to name. The death of certainty. The end of his conviction that she was nothing but a threat. The beginning of something he was not ready to acknowledge, let alone speak aloud. The next morning, Verity found a pair of work gloves on the kitchen table. They were too large for her hands. They were old and broken in and soft from years of use, the leather molded to fingers much bigger than hers. They had been carefully selected from among many. There was no note. There was no explanation. There did not need to be. Beckett Stone did not know how to say what he felt. He had forgotten the language of it years ago, if he ever knew it at all. But he could leave a pair of gloves on a table and hope that the woman who found them would understand what he could not put into words. She understood. 2 weeks after Verity's arrival, Beckett rode into Fort Benton alone to buy rope and fencing supplies. He tied his horse outside the feed store and walked into the saloon for a drink of water before the ride back. He was halfway to the bar when a man materialized beside him the way bad weather materializes on a clear day, sudden, unwelcome, and carrying the promise of damage. Victor Hargrove was 55 years old. He wore clothes that cost more than most men in Fort Benton earned in a month. His face was lean and composed with the practiced pleasantness of a man who had learned long ago that a smile could open doors that a fist could not. His eyes were the color of creek water in winter, clear and cold and absolutely empty of warmth. Beckett Stone, it has been a while. I hear your brother has brought home a bride, and her mother as well. 2 more mouths to feed on a ranch that is already stretched thin. Beckett went rigid. What do you want, Hargrove? Hargrove did not threaten. He did not raise his voice or make demands or do any of the things that would have given Beckett a reason to respond with his fists. Instead, he offered something far more dangerous. Understanding. I know you are not happy about this arrangement, Hargrove said, his voice pitched low and intimate, the voice of a confidant rather than an adversary. I know Garrett made this decision without consulting you. I know what that feels like, Beckett, being treated like a hired hand on your own land, having your voice ignored in your own family. You do not know anything about my family. I know about Rosalie. The name dropped like a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward through Beckett's body, reaching places he thought he had sealed shut. She worked for me. Yes, I will not pretend otherwise. But I will tell you something. What she felt for you was real. She told me that herself. She was supposed to gather information, and she did. But her feelings for you were genuine. The lie was expertly crafted. It found the one crack in Beckett's armor and poured itself in, like water, through a fissure in rock. Because part of Beckett, the part he kept locked in a room so deep inside himself that even his brothers did not know it existed, still wondered, still asked the question in the dark hours of sleepless nights. Was any of it real? Did she feel anything at all? Here is what I am proposing, Hargrove continued. Your share of the Stone Ranch, 1/3, I will pay you $5,000 for it. Cash. You can go anywhere you want, do anything you want. Build your own life instead of living as Garrett's shadow. $5,000 in 1878 was indeed a fortune, more money than most men saw in a decade. And Hargrove had aimed his words with the precision of a marksman, hitting every bruise and pressure point that Beckett carried. The feeling of being subordinate on land that was supposed to be equally his. The rage at Garrett for making unilateral decisions. The unhealed wound of Rosalie's betrayal. The hunger for something that belonged to him alone. Beckett did not answer. He left the saloon without his water, mounted his horse, and rode back to the ranch in silence. For 3 days after that encounter, Beckett was different, colder, more withdrawn than usual, which was saying something for a man whose default state was already Arctic. He avoided Garrett's eyes. He ate alone. He worked the range from dawn until well past dark, as if trying to outride something that had attached itself to his thinking and would not let go. Verity noticed. She had spent years reading children, and children were nothing if not transparent displays of emotional weather. Adults were only marginally more complex. She said nothing to Beckett directly, but she told Garrett quietly on the porch one evening, "Something has happened to your brother. Something from outside this house. He needs you." But it was not Garrett who reached Beckett. It was Harriet. She was sewing when Beckett came into the kitchen for water on the 3rd day. The house was otherwise empty. Verity was gathering eggs. Garrett and Tucker were in the upper pasture. Just the two of them, the old woman and the angry man, in a kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke. Harriet looked up from her machine and fixed Beckett with those faded blue eyes that cut through pretense the way a hot blade cuts through butter. "Someone has been filling your ears with poison," Harriet said. It was not a question. Beckett froze with the dipper halfway to his mouth. "Excuse me. I have lived 63 years, Beckett Stone. I know what a man looks like when someone has planted doubt in his mind about the people he loves. My Thomas was the same way once. A man at the university told him his family was holding him back, that his ideals were worthless, that he should abandon his schools and his causes and take a comfortable position where he would not have to fight every day of his life." She set down her sewing and looked at him directly. Her eyes were faded, but the intelligence behind them burned with a clarity that age had not dimmed. Thomas almost listened. He was tired and poor, and the fighting never seemed to end. But he came home one evening and he looked at me and he looked at Verity, who was 5 years old and reading a book by the fire, and he said, "Harriet, I nearly made the worst mistake of my life today. Because a man who tells you your family is a burden is a man who wants you to be alone. And a man alone is a man who can be destroyed. A man alone is a man who can be destroyed." The room was very quiet. The fire popped. The sewing machine sat silent. Outside, a horse whinnied in the corral, and the sound seemed to come from very far away. "You are being told that your family is a burden," Harriet said, "that your brothers do not value you, that you would be better off alone. Whoever is telling you this does not want you free, Beckett. He wants you separated because he knows he cannot beat the three of you together." Beckett stood absolutely still for a long moment. His eyes moved slowly around the kitchen, the fireplace his father built, the table Tucker made, the sewing machine Garrett bought for Harriet, the bookshelf that held Verity's small collection of volumes, the smell of bread that Verity had set to rise before going out to the chickens. Every object in this room had been placed here by someone who belonged to this family. Every surface bore the marks of hands that had chosen to build something together rather than apart. "Hargrove," Beckett said quietly. "Hargrove offered to buy my share, $5,000. Harriet did not look surprised. "Of course he did. That is what men like him do. They find the crack and they pour themselves in." She looked at him with an expression that combined the firmness of a general with the gentleness of a grandmother. "The most dangerous lie is the one wrapped around a kernel of truth. Garrett did make a decision without asking you. That is real, and you have a right to be angry about it. But the answer to that anger is not selling your birthright to the man who murdered your father. The answer is standing in your brother's kitchen and saying, 'I am here. This is my home, and no one is taking it from me.' Stones do not run." She did not say those words that afternoon, but they were there in the bedrock of everything she said, waiting to be spoken aloud when the time was right. That evening, Beckett found Garrett and Tucker on the porch and told them everything. Hargrove's approach, the offer, the lie about Rosalie, the 3 days of temptation that followed. Garrett listened with a face of stone and fists that went white at the knuckles. Tucker listened with eyes that grew darker with each sentence. When Beckett finished, the silence on the porch was the kind that precedes either violence or resolution. There was no middle ground. "I will not sell," Beckett said. "This is Pa's land. This is our home, and Hargrove can go straight to the devil." Garrett put his hand on Beckett's shoulder. The grip was hard and real and said more than any words could have managed. Tucker stepped forward and wrapped both brothers in an embrace that would have been comical under other circumstances. 3 enormous men clutching each other on a porch in the mountain twilight. But it was in that moment the most honest expression of love that any of them had managed in years. Look what grew from that single choice, Harriet had said. And she was right. One act of trust, one decision to open a door instead of closing it, and everything that followed grew from that root like a tree grows from a seed planted in good soil. 3 weeks after Verity's arrival, the courtship began in earnest, though neither Garrett nor Verity would have called it that. They would have called it riding lessons. Garrett selected the gentlest mare in the string, a bay named Penny, who had the temperament of a large dog and the patience of a schoolteacher. He spent hours in the corral with Verity, teaching her the basics of horsemanship, with the same steady patience he brought to everything. How to hold the reins without gripping them like a lifeline. How to use your legs and your weight to communicate direction. How to approach a horse, always from the left side, never from behind, unless you wanted a trip to the nearest doctor, which was 60 miles away and not particularly good when you got there. How to saddle, cinched tight enough that the saddle would not spin, but not so tight the horse could not breathe. Verity asked how you knew the difference. Garrett said experience. Verity pointed out she had no experience. Garrett said she would after she fell enough times. Verity was a quick study with her mind and a disaster with her body. She understood the theory immediately and executed it with the coordination of a newborn foal. She listed to the left. She bounced when she should have sat. She pulled the reins when she should have released them and released them when she should have held steady. She fell off Penny 3 times in the first week. The first time, Penny stopped suddenly because a chicken crossed the corral. Verity departed the saddle in a graceful arc that was impressive if you did not count the landing. She stood up with dust on both cheeks and grass in her hair. "That chicken," she said with grave dignity, clearly does not understand right of way. The second time she fell while attempting a right turn, Penny turned. Verity did not. Newton's laws separated them with ruthless efficiency. The third time, she picked herself up from the dirt, brushed off a dress that was rapidly becoming unsuitable for anything except scarecrow duty, and looked at Penny with an expression of pure, stubborn determination that was worth more than any amount of natural riding talent. I believe this horse and I have a philosophical disagreement about the direction of travel, Verity announced, and she climbed back on. Garrett found himself watching her with something that went beyond instruction. The way she set her jaw after each fall, the way she refused to let embarrassment gain purchase, the way she spoke to Penny in the same calm voice she had used with Copper in the barn, as if horses were simply large students who needed patient teaching. He was also more aware than he wanted to be of every moment of physical contact during these lessons. His hand at her waist when she wobbled, his fingers over hers on the reins adjusting her grip, his arm catching her when she slid sideways. Each touch was necessary and brief and careful, and each one burned itself into his memory with an intensity that surprised him. Her waist was small enough that his hand could nearly span it. Her fingers inside his were delicate and precise. She smelled of soap and bread flour and something clean and warm that he had no name for but would recognize in a crowd of 1,000. Verity was aware of him too. He could see it in the way her breathing changed when he stood close. Lighter, shallower, as if her lungs forgot how to function normally. In the color that rose in her cheeks when their hands touched a peach pink that spread from her throat to her cheekbones, and he realized the most beautiful color he had ever seen on anything. In the way her eyes followed him across the yard when she thought he was not looking. He was looking. He was always looking now, and that bothered him in a way that simultaneously did not bother him at all. From inside the barn, Beckett watched the riding lessons while pretending to repair tack that had already been perfectly repaired the week before. He said nothing, but a ghost of something that was not quite a smile crossed his face each time Verity fell, stood up, made a dry remark, and climbed back on. Courage interested Beckett, stubbornness he respected, and the combination of both in a woman who weighed less than his saddle was beginning to work on him in ways he did not fully understand. Tucker contributed to the atmosphere of courtship in his own way. He built a bookshelf for Verity. It appeared one afternoon in the main room while she was out collecting eggs. A beautiful piece of carpentry with hand-carved vine patterns climbing up both sides, the wood sanded to a finish, so smooth it felt like touching water. He used ponderosa pine, the best wood he had, the kind he usually reserved for his most important projects. The vine pattern he carved freehand from memory flowers he had seen climbing granite outcroppings on the mountainside every spring. When Verity saw the bookshelf, she stood before it for a long moment without speaking. Then she touched a fingertip to the vine pattern, tracing it from root to bloom, feeling the smoothness of the grain beneath her skin. And tears filled her eyes. "Tucker," she said, her voice dropping half a register with emotion. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." Tucker Stone's 6'5", 220 pounds of muscle and bone hands capable of snapping fence posts turned the color of a September sunset from his collar to the tips of his ears. "Just wood and nails," he mumbled, studying his boots with the intensity of a man reading scripture in Hebrew. "It is not just wood and nails," Verity said firmly, the teacher's voice emerging. The voice that compelled attention from anyone who heard it, from children to grown men 3 times her weight. "It is a home for my books. And anyone who builds a home for books understands what matters in this world." Later, she found him in the barn carving a small wooden horse and asked him to teach her. They sat together on hay bales, Tucker's enormous hands guiding Verity's smaller ones on the knife shaping the curve of a horse's neck from a block of pine. He read her a poem he had written, haltingly, embarrassed, his deep voice barely above a whisper. It was about the mountains at dawn. About the way the first light touched the Bitterroot Peaks like a hand gently waking granite from sleep. It was beautiful. Verity told him so and meant it, and Tucker looked at her as if she had given him something precious. And she had. She had given him the recognition that his sensitive heart was not a weakness but a gift. Harriet observed all of this with the sharp eye of a woman who had spent 63 years studying human behavior. She saw clearly that all 3 brothers cared for Verity. Garrett with quiet, burning devotion. Beckett with grudging, reluctant protectiveness. that he himself did not yet recognize. Tucker with open brotherly affection that was pure and uncomplicated. But Harriet also saw with the certainty of a woman who had loved deeply and understood its workings that Verity's heart had chosen Garrett. It was visible in the way her daughter's eyes tracked him when he entered a room, in the way her voice changed when she spoke to him, dropping half a register and softening at the edges, in the way her hands stilled on whatever task they were performing when his boots sounded on the porch steps. "He is a good man," Harriet told Verity one evening when they were alone in their room. "All three of them are, but Garrett is the one your heart has fixed on. I can see it every time you look at him." "Mama," Verity protested, her cheeks flushing. "Do not mama me, Verity Grace. I am old, not blind, and certainly not deaf. I hear your breathing change when he walks into a room." Harriet's voice softened. "You deserve to be loved, child, not just sheltered, not just respected, loved, the way your father loved me, like you were the answer to a question he did not know he was asking." 2 weeks after her arrival on a cool evening when the first stars were appearing above the Bitterroot Peaks, Verity and Garrett sat alone on the porch. Harriet was sleeping. Beckett and Tucker had retired. The night was enormous and clear, the kind of sky that makes a person feel both infinitely small and infinitely connected to something larger than any human life. "I need you to understand why we left Philadelphia the way we did," Verity said quietly. She told him. The school closing overnight. No income, no references, no prospects, going everywhere in Philadelphia looking for work, teaching, tutoring, mending, anything. But no one would hire a woman who came with the burden of an ailing mother. They said it plainly. She was a risk. The boarding house owner gave them 1 week. 1 week to pay her leave. Your advertisement was in a newspaper someone left on the common room table. Montana territory, clean mountain air, a man looking to build a life based on mutual respect and kindness. Her voice was steady, but Garrett could hear the current of old fear running beneath the surface. "I read those words at it 10 times, and I thought this is the only door still open for both of us." "You did the right thing," Garrett said, and his voice was quiet but absolute. "You had no good choices, so you made the brave one. You got your mother out of a place that was killing her, and you brought her to a place where she might live. That is not desperation, Verity. That is love." Something in her expression broke open. Not dramatically, gently. The way dawn breaks over the mountains, light spreading slowly across the peaks until the whole world is changed and you cannot point to the single moment it happened. "You are safe here," Garrett said. "Both of you. I give you my word on that. A man keeps his word." "I believe you," Verity whispered. And she did. For the first time since her father died 15 years ago, she looked at a man and believed that his word was more than sounds arranged in the shape of promises. 3 weeks after Verity's arrival on a brilliant October afternoon, when the aspens were at their peak and the sky was the impossible blue that only Montana can produce, Garrett took her to Eagle's Peak. It was the highest point on Stoneland, a granite overlook where the world unfolded below in a panorama that made words feel small and inadequate. The Bitterroot Mountains marched northward in a procession of stone and snow. The valley spread out like a quilt stitched from gold and amber and the deep green of evergreen forests. The sky was so vast that standing beneath it made a person feel both infinitely small and infinitely connected to something larger than any human life. They sat on a flat rock, their horses grazing nearby. The sun was lowering, painting everything in light that seemed to come from another world. Garrett draped a blanket over Verity's shoulders as the temperature dropped, and his hands lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary. Verity felt the warmth of him through the wool and did not pull away. "I have fallen in love with you," Garrett said, plainly, directly, the way he did everything, without flourish or performance, just the truth offered with both hands. "Not because you are here, not because the arrangement brought you, not because it is convenient or practical or any of the other words I used to justify placing that advertisement. I love you because of who you are, your courage and your kindness. The way you walked into a barn in a thunderstorm and saved a horse you had never touched. The way you laugh at yourself when you fall off penny. The way you read to your mother by lamplight when you think no one is listening." His whiskey-colored eyes held hers without flinching. I love you, Verity Grace Ashford, and I am asking you properly and honestly to be my wife, not because of letters or advertisements, because we found each other and I do not want to let you go. Yes, she whispered. The word came out half laugh and half sob. Yes, Garrett, I will marry you because I love you too, your patience and your decency, and the way you made room for Mama and me without a moment of hesitation. Your quiet strength and your terrible singing when you think no one can hear. The way you look at these mountains like they are something sacred. I love you and I want to build a life with you here. Together. He kissed her then. It was her first kiss. And the gentleness of it, the careful questioning tenderness with which Garrett Stone, a man who could break fence posts with his bare hands, pressed his lips to hers, asking rather than taking, offering rather than demanding, was the most overwhelming thing Verity Grace Ashford had ever experienced. They rode home under stars that seemed close enough to touch. When they walked into the house hand in hand, Harriet smiled with the serenity of a woman whose prayers had been answered. Tucker lifted Verity clean off the ground in a bear hug that made her squeak. And Beckett, serious guarded Beckett, extended his hand to Garrett and shook it with a force that said everything words could not. Welcome to the family, Tucker said, grinning so wide it seemed to rearrange his whole face. For real this time. But what came next would test that family to its foundations. Victor Hargrove, having failed to buy Beckett, played his next card. He appeared at the Territorial Land Office with a document, old, yellowed, cracked at the folds, bearing stamps and signatures that appeared to date from half a century earlier. He presented it with the calm authority of a man filing a routine claim. The document purported to be a deed of sale proving that the land on which the Stone Ranch sat had been legally purchased by Hargrove's father in 1825 from a Spanish land grant holder. If authentic, the deed would establish that every stone who ever worked that land was a trespasser, that the house Duncan built and the barn his sons expanded, and the corrals and the pastures and the creek and the meadows and every blade of grass the Stone name had been associated with for 20 years belonged legally and irrevocably to Victor Hargrove. The news reached Garrett 2 days before his wedding. The timing was not coincidental. Hargrove understood that a legal battle would drain resources and attention. That uncertainty about the future would cast a shadow over the marriage before it even began. Beckett wanted to ride to Hargrove's ranch that night with rifles loaded. Tucker counseled patience and legal process. Garrett stood between his brothers as he always did, the fulcrum on which the family balanced. Judge Wainwright is fair, Garrett said. He is the one honest man in the territory. He will see through a forged deed. And if he does not, Beckett's voice was tighted as a bowstring. The law did not save Pa. The words fell between them like a stone into a well dropping into a silence so deep that no one heard it hit bottom. It was Verity who broke the impasse. She stepped through the doorway with the quiet authority that surfaced when her spine of steel took over from her nature of gentleness. We will not let this stop the wedding, she said. All three brothers turned to look at her. I did not travel 2,000 miles to be run off by a bully with a piece of paper. We get married Saturday as planned, and Monday morning we begin fighting for our home, together. Stones do not run. She did not say those words either. Not yet, but she was already living them. The wedding took place in the small church in Fort Benton on a November morning when the first snow of the season was just beginning to dust the mountaintops. Harriet poured what remained of her waning strength into creating Verity's dress. Pale blue fabric from the mercantile transformed by 30 years of master craftsmanship into a garment of quiet, exquisite beauty. The embroidery alone took Harriet a week, tiny wildflowers cascading down the bodice stitched so fine they appeared painted rather than sewn. It was her masterwork, her gift, the last great creation of hands that had spent a lifetime making beautiful things from ordinary cloth. Verity wore the dress and she was radiant, not the artificial glow of cosmetics or the practiced grace of someone who has been taught to perform beauty. The real thing, the light that comes from inside a woman who knows with a certainty that goes deeper than thought that she is standing exactly where she belongs. Garrett stood at the altar, and when Verity appeared at the back of the church on no one's arm, because she had no one to give her away, his expression cracked open. The stoic mountain man's face transformed into something so raw and full of wonder that half the congregation wiped their eyes. Harriet sat in the front row, weeping openly, flanked by Tucker on one side and Beckett on the other. At some point during the ceremony, without planning or forethought, Beckett reached across and covered Harriet's trembling hand with his own scarred one. He did not look at her. She did not look at him, but neither of them let go. That evening, after a celebration that filled the valley with music and laughter, after Verity had danced with each brother in turn, and Beckett had told her quietly that she was good for all of them, and that he was sorry it took him so long to see it, the door of the main bedroom closed softly behind Garrett and Verity Stone. When morning came, everything between them had changed, deepened, solidified into something unbreakable. They emerged into the kitchen with a quiet radiance that told the household without a single word being spoken that the marriage was complete in every way that mattered. Tucker had breakfast waiting. Beckett had already ridden out to check the herd. Harriet was at her sewing machine humming a hymn. And the Stone house, for the first time in more than a decade, felt like a home. But winter was coming, and it would bring with it a fury that none of them had ever known. In January, the worst blizzard in a decade descended on the Bitterroot Valley. 3 consecutive days of wind and snow so intense that the world beyond the ranch house walls ceased to exist. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. On the second night of the storm, 3 catastrophes struck simultaneously. Harriet collapsed. Verity found her mother on the floor of the bedroom, barely breathing, her lips the color of a bruise. Her pulse so faint that Verity had to press her fingers against Harriet's throat for 10 seconds before she felt the weak, irregular flutter of a heart that was losing its battle. At the same moment, from the direction of the barn, a sound split the night. Not the wind, not the cattle. A roar, deep, guttural, primordial, the sound of a predator driven down from the high country by starvation, 400 pounds of muscle and fury that had found the scent of livestock through the storm. Grizzly bear, in the barn, with the horses and the remaining feed stores that represented the difference between surviving the winter and losing everything. Garrett made the decision in the space of a single breath, the way he had made every critical decision for this family since he was 24 years old. Not by calculation, but by instinct, honed through a decade of crisis. Tucker, ride to the Dawson Ranch, get Cordelia, bring medicine, whatever they have. 2 miles east, an impossible distance in a whiteout at 40 below. But Tucker was the best horseman among them, the one with the animal instinct for navigation that could read terrain even when visibility was zero. Beckett, the bear, keep it away from the horses and the feed. Do not let it get into the barn. Beckett was the fighter, the one who would face down a charging animal with nothing but a rifle and the particular recklessness that comes from having survived things that should have killed you. I will stay here. Garrett lifted Harriet from the floor as gently as if she were made of paper and carried her to the main room closest to the fire where the heat was strongest. His role was not to fight or to ride. His role was to hold the center, to keep the fire burning and the women alive and the house standing while his brothers went into the storm. Tucker was out the door before Garrett finished speaking. He saddled his horse in the barn, dodging the shadow of the grizzly that was tearing at the far wall, and rode into the blizzard like a man riding into the mouth of something that wanted to swallow him whole. The snow was chest deep on the horse in places. The wind hit with a force that nearly unseated him twice. Visibility was zero, nothing but white in every direction. But Tucker Stone had something that could not be measured or taught. He had been born in these mountains. He navigated by wind direction and slope angle and the particular feel of the ground beneath his horse's hooves. He reached the Dawson Ranch in 40 minutes, both he and the horse coated in ice and shaking with exhaustion, but alive. He returned an hour later with Cordelia Dawson and a saddlebag of medicines. The ride back nearly killed the horse, and Tucker would carry frostbite scars on 3 fingers of his left hand for the rest of his life. But he brought help. That was what mattered. That was his moment, the thing that only he could do. Beckett faced the grizzly alone. The bear had broken through the barn's back wall where age and weather had weakened the logs. It was a male gaunt from a winter that came too early, 400 pounds of hunger and fury. It was destroying the feed stores, scattering hay bales, and the horses were screaming in their stalls. Beckett entered the barn with his rifle a torch and the absolute certainty that if the bear got past him, the horses would die, the feed would be lost, and the ranch would not survive the winter. He could have shot immediately, but a gunshot in the enclosed barn during a storm would have panicked the horses past the point of containment. So Beckett did what Beckett did. He stepped between the grizzly and the livestock. He planted his boots in the frozen dirt. He raised his torch high, and he roared, not a shout, a roar. The sound that a man makes when he has decided that fear is irrelevant and that whatever is standing in front of him will have to go through him or go somewhere else because he is not moving. The bear stopped. 400 pounds of predator and 20 feet of barn floor between them, and the bear stopped. It swung its massive head toward Beckett, and for a moment that lasted approximately forever, man and grizzly stared at each other in the torchlight, while the storm raged outside and the horses screamed, and the world contracted to a point of pure, distilled confrontation. The bear charged. Beckett fired once. The bullet hit the bear's shoulder. Not a kill shot, a deterrent. The impact staggered, the animal broke its momentum, and the pain combined with the fire of the torch and the man who would not back down was enough. The grizzly turned. It crashed back through the hole it had made in the wall and disappeared into the storm. Beckett stood in the barn torch in one hand, smoking rifle in the other, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it over the wind. Then he went to the horses and calmed them, one by one, with the same hands that had just driven off a grizzly bear. Inside the house, Garrett held the center. He stoked the fire to a roar. He wrapped Harriet in every blanket they owned. Verity knelt beside her mother, holding Harriet's hand, talking to her the same way she had talked to Copper in the barn during the thunderstorm. Steady, calm, refusing to let go. Winter always ends. Verity whispered it to her mother like a prayer, though outside the storm showed no signs of ending, and inside the house the fire was the only thing standing between them and the kind of cold that stops hearts. When Cordelia Dawson arrived with Tucker, she took over with the efficiency of a frontier woman who had seen worse and survived it. She administered medicines. She monitored the failing heartbeat. She did everything that could be done. "The next 12 hours will tell," Cordelia said. "Her heart is weak, but her will is strong. Sometimes that is enough." It was enough. Harriet survived the night. She survived the storm. And on the third morning, when the blizzard finally broke and the world emerged from beneath its white shroud, battered but intact, Harriet opened her eyes and looked at Beckett, who had not left her side since the bear was driven off. "The papers," Harriet said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her eyes were focused and sharp. "Verity, get the trunk." Verity retrieved the battered trunk they had carried from Philadelphia. Harriet directed her to the false bottom. Not a secret compartment that no one knew about, but a space that Harriet had always known was there. A place where she kept the things that mattered most. "Your father's mining claims," Harriet said. "He filed them in Montana Territory in 1855 before we were married. In the Bitterroot Valley." She looked at Garrett with those faded blue eyes that missed nothing. "When Verity told me your ranch was in the Bitterroot, I recognized the name. Thomas spoke of it constantly. I brought these papers with us deliberately. I did not know if they would matter, but a woman who has lost everything learns to carry whatever she has left." Garrett read the documents. His face became very still. "Harriet," he said slowly, "these mining claims were filed with the Federal Land Office in Helena. They are stamped and registered and dated 1855. They cover land that includes part of our ranch and part of Hargrove's property." "What does that mean?" Verity asked. "It means the United States government considered this land to be unowned federal territory in 1855. If it had been privately owned since 1825, as Hargrove's deed claims, the government would never have accepted your father's claims." Garrett looked at his wife. "These documents prove that Hargrove's deed cannot be authentic. Your father's mining claims destroy his case." The room was silent. Then Harriet smiled. Small, tired, triumphant. The smile of a woman who had carried a secret weapon across 2,000 miles without knowing whether she would ever need to use it. "Thomas always said Montana would matter again someday," Harriet whispered. "I suppose he was right. Built this with our own hands. All of them. Duncan Stone, who built the ranch. Thomas Ashford, who filed the mining claims. Harriet, who carried the papers across a continent on a failing heart. Verity, who answered an advertisement because she believed in the possibility of a new beginning. Garrett, who wrote 6 words on a boardwalk that changed everything. Our home has room for both. And now, armed with documents that a dead professor filed 23 years before the Stones ever saw this valley, they would fight for that home. Together. But Hargrove was not a man who accepted defeat. He had ordered the murder of Duncan Stone 10 years before without losing a night's sleep. And now learning about the mining claims through his network of paid informants, he would make a decision that crossed the line from intimidation into something far darker. And the Stones would discover that the most dangerous moment in any fight is the one where your enemy realizes he is losing. But that is a story for the final part. The attack came on a moonless February night. Four riders approached from the east through the narrow pass that Beckett called the back gate, a route that wound around the hillside behind the ranch, avoiding the sightline from the main house. Their horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth, an old trick but effective on packed snow. The east wind carried the smell of horses and tobacco away from the ranch, not toward it. They carried unlit torches, loaded rifles, and clear orders. The barn first. Burn the feed stores. Break the stall gates so the horses would bolt into the darkness. Cripple the ranch's operations in a single night, and send a message that courtrooms and mining claims would be the least of the Stones' problems if they did not abandon the land. Cade Thorne led them, a man for whom violence was neither personal nor emotional, but simply the most efficient tool available. He had done this kind of work before for Hargrove and for others, and he approached it with the professional detachment of a carpenter approaching a house that needed demolition. They did not know two things. First, Beckett Stone slept light as a hunting cat and had done so every night for 10 years since learning that his father had been shot in the back on a road 5 miles from home. His hearing sharpened by 1,000 nights of waking to panicked cattle and wolves howling too close and branches breaking in the forest that meant bear had become survival instinct. He heard unfamiliar hoofbeats at 200 yards while sleeping and went from unconscious to fully awake with his hand on his rifle in 3 seconds. Second, the three Stone brothers had coordinated the defense of this land their entire adult lives. They did not need to discuss positions. Each man knew his angle of fire. Each man knew where his brothers would be in the darkness. Beckett woke his brothers with a single word: riders. Within 90 seconds, all three were armed and positioned. Garrett at the front door, his Winchester braced on the windowsill covering the main approach from the gate to the well. Beckett at the east window covering the back gate where he had heard the horses. Tucker at the rear door covering the path to the barn. "That is far enough," Garrett called into the darkness. His voice carried evenly across the yard. Not raised, was doing. The voice of a man who understood that strength does not need to shout. "You are on Stone land. Turn around, by." The voice that came back was cold and professional, delivering a message from Mr. Hargrove. "He suggests you reconsider your position regarding the land. Things could get difficult for a man with a new wife and a sick old woman to protect." The threat to Verity and Harriet was calculated, engineered to provoke, and it worked exactly as intended, though not on the brother Hargrove had expected. Beckett stepped out from cover. In the darkness, he was a silhouette, broad shoulders, head lowered, the posture of a man who had decided that fear was irrelevant and that whatever stood before him would have to go through him or go somewhere else because he was not moving. "Threaten our family again," Beckett said, his voice carrying the cold quiet of a man who has made peace with whatever comes next, "and I will put you in the ground beside my father." Gunfire erupted. Muzzle flashes split the darkness like low lightning. Bullets tore through the air and splintered the porch railing. In the chaos of sound and shadow, Beckett took a bullet in the left shoulder. The impact spun him. He went down hard in the snow, blood hot on frozen ground, his right hand still gripping his rifle because the fighting instinct kept his finger on the trigger, even as pain whited out everything from shoulder to spine. Tucker was on him in seconds, dragging his brother behind the oak water trough that Duncan Stone had built 20 years before. The old wood was thick enough to stop a bullet. Tucker covered his brother with his own body, a shield of bone and muscle, while Garrett fired from the front door. Steady, measured, each shot placed to push the riders back, not to waste ammunition. But in the instant before the bullet hit him, in the frozen fraction of a second, when Cade Thorne's muzzle flash lit the night like a photographer's powder, Beckett saw something that would change everything. The horse Thorne rode. Dark, big, with a scar on its left haunch. Not a wound scar, a brand scar. The iron mark of Hargrove's ranch burned into the hide of every animal Victor Hargrove owned. A mark Beckett had seen on 100 of Hargrove's horses over the years. Unmistakable, Undeniable. Beckett filed the detail in his memory with the clarity of a man who understood that evidence wins battles that bullets cannot. Then the pain hit in full and the world went red, then black. Inside the house, Verity heard the gunfire and moved without thinking. She barricaded the bedroom door where Harriet lay, shoving the chair under the handle and dragging the heavy trunk against it. She placed herself between the window and her mother. If anyone fired through the glass, the bullet would have to go through her first. Then she saw him through the kitchen window. A fifth rider, one who had circled behind the house while the brothers were engaged at the front. He carried an unlit torch and a flint striker, and he was moving toward the barn with the purposeful stride of a man completing an assigned task. The barn, where Copper and Penny and the foal sheltered, where the remaining feed vat would keep the horses alive until spring was stored, where Tucker's workshop held the tools he used to build and repair everything on the ranch. The rifle hung above the fireplace mantel. Verity crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. She grabbed the rifle. Heavy, cold, surprisingly familiar in her hands after those October afternoons when Garrett had patiently taught her to shoot. School teachers do not need firearms. She had laughed and Garrett had answered, school teachers in Philadelphia do not. Stone women in Montana do. She checked the chamber the way Garrett taught her. 1 round loaded. She braced the stock against her right shoulder, left hand supporting the barrel, eye to the sight. She remembered his instruction. Breathe out halfway and squeeze. She fired through the kitchen window. The glass shattered. The report rang in her ears. The recoil slammed her shoulder because she forgot to brace for the kick. She missed. The bullet struck a fence post 6 feet to the left of the man with the torch, but 6 feet in the darkness from a direction nobody expected when you thought only men with rifles were shooting and you discovered a woman was firing too. 6 feet was close enough. The man dropped his unlit torch into the snow and ran. Ran with the urgency of a man who had just recalculated the risk to reward ratio of his employment and found it severely wanting. The barn was saved. When it was over, when the riders had fled into the darkness and the night had settled back into cold silence, Garrett found Verity in the kitchen. She was standing with the rifle still at her shoulder, arms shaking, face white as the snow outside. Broken glass lay scattered on the floor around her feet. Night wind blew through the shattered window, carrying the smell of gunpowder and frost. Behind her in the doorway to the bedroom, Harriet stood. She had somehow gotten past the barricade, somehow risen from bed despite a heart that had nearly stopped 2 months before. She held a cast-iron skillet above her head with both trembling hands, her silver hair loose, her faded blue eyes blazing in the lamplight. She looked like the most terrifying grandmother in the history of the Montana Territory. She is a stone now, Harriet said, her thin voice carrying a fierceness that defied her frail body. And stones do not run. Stones do not run. The third time those words were spoken. The first had been Harriet's quiet conviction. The second had been implied in Verity's refusal to let the wedding be postponed. Now standing in a kitchen with broken glass and gun smoke and a skillet raised like a battle axe, Harriet spoke them aloud as a family motto forged in fire. Beckett's wound was serious. The bullet had lodged in his shoulder, and without proper extraction, infection would be certain. Cordelia Dawson arrived the next morning and performed the extraction on the kitchen table, while Tucker held his brother down, and Verity assisted with hands that were steady, despite the terror behind her eyes. For 3 days, fever raged through Beckett like wildfire. He drifted in and out of consciousness while the household held its breath. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. The first word out of his mouth was not a request for water or a complaint about pain. It was a name. Verity. Not calling for her, asking about her, whether she was safe, whether the riders had come back, whether anyone else had been hurt while he lay burning and useless. Verity appeared at his bedside within seconds. Dark circles beneath her cornflower blue eyes. Her honey blonde hair pulled back in a knot that had given up all pretense of neatness 2 days ago. But she was smiling. Tucker told me, Beckett said, his voice a ruined whisper, about the rifle. You shot at an armed man in the dark. Someone had to, Verity replied with a steadiness that did not quite reach her eyes. You were busy being dramatic. Beckett laughed. The sound was painful and wheezing, and it made him clutch his bandaged shoulder, but it was real. The first genuine laugh that anyone in the house had heard from Beckett Stone in longer than anyone could remember. Definitely a stone, Beckett said. During the weeks of recovery that followed, Beckett and Harriet talked. Long hours in chairs by the fire, the old woman sewing, while the wounded man sat restless and healing. And between them unfolded the most important conversations either would ever have. Beckett told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could read, about his father teaching him to track deer through mountain forests, about his mother teaching him to see the good in people. He told her about the day his father was killed, about the years of rage that followed, the black furnace inside his chest that never fully cooled, the way it shaped every decision and poisoned every relationship. Harriet listened without judgment, without the need to fix or advise. She simply received his words and held them. Then she told him something she had not told anyone, not even Verity. While Thomas was in Montana in 1855, a man approached him about buying his mining claims. Thomas refused. The man became threatening in a way Thomas said was different from anything he had experienced before. A coldness, as if the man considered other people to be obstacles rather than human beings. Beckett went very still. The man told Thomas that no piece of paper would stop him from owning that land, that it would be his one way or another. Harriet looked at Beckett steadily. The name was Hargrove, and Thomas remembered those words for the rest of his life. The connection spanned decades. Hargrove threatening Thomas Ashford in 1855. Hargrove ordering the murder of Duncan Stone in 1868. Hargrove sending Rosalie Voss to spy on the brothers. Hargrove offering $5,000 to split the family apart. Hargrove filing a forged deed. Hargrove sending armed men in the night. A pattern of obsession. A family curse. And the papers that could end it had traveled 2,000 miles in the false bottom of a battered trunk carried by a woman with a failing heart who brought them because her dying husband told her they would matter someday. That is why I brought those papers across 2,000 miles, Beckett. Not just because they were Thomas's, because Thomas told me the night before he died that if anyone ever tried to take land in the Bitterroot Valley, those papers would matter. He did not know how. He did not know when, but he was certain. While Beckett recovered, Garrett went to war. Not with guns, with something more dangerous to a man like Victor Hargrove. The truth. He rode to every neighboring ranch within 20 miles. He sat at kitchen tables and drank coffee from chipped cups and told the truth about Hargrove. Not rumors, not accusations, documented facts. The forged deed, the poisoned cattle, the nighttime riders with torches, the bullet extracted from Beckett's shoulder on a kitchen table while his wife held the lamp steady. Many of these families had suffered under Hargrove's shadow for years. The Hendersons lost prime grazing land to one of Hargrove's boundary adjustments. The McDonalds were forced to sell 50 head of cattle at half their value after Hargrove threatened to divert their water supply. The Petersons found their fences cut so frequently they stopped repairing them. 12 families said yes. 12 families who had been afraid for years discovered that courage is contagious. That standing shoulder to shoulder is easier than standing alone. Old Mr. McDonald put it in terms every man in the territory understood. My father would have been ashamed of me for keeping silent this long. If a young man with a shot brother and a wife carrying his first child can fight, then I have run out of excuses. Verity opened the ranch to the community. Sunday gatherings, not strategy meetings, meals, shared food around tables that Tucker built from spare lumber to accommodate the crowds. Children playing together in the yard while their parents talked openly, many for the first time, about what Hargrove had done to them. Harriet mended clothes for every family that visited free of charge. When Garrett protested the expense, Harriet ended the conversation with 5 words. They are fighting for us. Beckett, once recovered enough to ride, visited each ranch personally. He inspected their livestock, their fences, their water. He documented every sign of Hargrove's interference with the cold, methodical precision of a man building a case brick by brick. Tucker built a new fence gate for the Petersons and repaired the Henderson barn door. Each act of generosity was a small stone added to a wall of solidarity that Hargrove's money could not breach. The valley was transforming. Families who had avoided each other's eyes in town now nodded in passing. The community that Hargrove's terror had fragmented was being rebuilt, not by force, by the simple radical act of people choosing to trust each other again, stronger together than apart. The hearing before Judge Cornelius Wainwright took place in the Fort Benton courthouse on an April morning so brilliant that the mountains seemed freshly painted. Every seat in the gallery was taken, and men stood along the walls 3 deep. Victor Hargrove sat at the left table with a Carlton, his Helena attorney, silver-haired, smooth-voiced, a man who had never lost a case in the territory. The Stones sat at the right table with Wesley Crane, who was 28 years old and visibly nervous, but carried a briefcase full of evidence that could bring an empire down. Verity sat in the front row, Harriet beside her, Beckett on Harriet's other side, his left arm still in a sling, his jaw set. Tucker stood at the back, too restless to sit. Wesley Crane was not smooth. He was not silver-haired. He was a young man from a small town who had taken this case because he believed in the people sitting behind him and because he had a stubborn conviction that the law should protect the powerless from the powerful rather than the other way around. He presented 3 pillars of evidence. First, the mining claims. Thomas Ashford's 1855 certificates filed with the Federal Land Office in Helena, stamped and registered and documented with the full authority of the United States government. If the federal government accepted these claims in 1855, treating this land as unowned federal territory, then no private sale could have occurred 30 years earlier. The existence of Thomas Ashford's claims was proof that the government considered this land to have no private owner in 1855. Hargrove's deed, which claimed the land was sold in 1825, was therefore impossible. Second, the handwriting analysis. A documents expert from Helena testified that the signatures on Hargrove's deed had been written with a steel nib pen. Steel nib pens were not commercially available in the American West until the early 1860s. A document supposedly signed in 1825 could not have been written with a pen that would not exist for another 35 years. Third, the community. One after another, the neighboring ranchers took the stand. They testified about what it was like to live next to Victor Hargrove. Beatings, threats, poisoned livestock, cut fences, stolen land. The portrait that emerged was not of a man defending legitimate rights, but of a predator who had been systematically terrorizing a community for over a decade. Then Crane called a witness that Carlton had not anticipated, Harriet Ashford Stone. She walked to the witness chair with Beckett's help, moving slowly, her silver hair catching the light from the tall courthouse windows. She was visibly frail. Her breathing was audible in the quiet room, but her back was straight and her eyes were clear, and her voice when she spoke carried with the steady precision of a woman who had spent 63 years choosing her words carefully and did not intend to waste any of them now. Crane asked her about Thomas. Harriet spoke about him the way you speak about someone you loved with your whole heart and lost too soon. A scholar, a dreamer, a man who traveled west in his youth looking for something he could not name and found it in the Montana mountains. Mrs. Stone, did your husband ever mention anyone named Hargrove in connection with his time in Montana? The courtroom was silent enough to hear dust settling on the windowsills. Yes, Harriet said. A man approached Thomas about purchasing his mining claims. Thomas refused. The man became aggressive, threatening. She paused. Thomas was not a man who frightened easily, Mr. Crane. He faced down university boards and factory owners and men who told him his schools for poor children were a waste of time. But he told me this man in Montana made him uneasy in a way that none of the others ever had. Did your husband say what this man said to him? Harriet looked directly at Victor Hargrove for the first time since taking the stand. Thomas remembered the words for the rest of his life. The man told him that no piece of paper would stop him from owning that land, that it would be his one way or another. She paused, still holding Hargrove's gaze. Those words frightened my husband. And Thomas Ashford was not a man who frightened easily. Carlton was on his feet, objecting. Hearsay. Judge Wainwright sustained the objection with a nod that was technically correct and practically meaningless. Every person in that gallery had heard the words. Every person understood what they meant. A pattern of obsession spanning decades. Then Crane called Beckett Stone. Beckett walked to the witness stand with his arm in a sling and his amber eyes burning. He described the February night attack with the economy of words that characterized everything about him. Mr. Stone, in the moment before you were shot, did you observe anything about the attackers or their horses that you could identify? I did, Beckett said. When the man who shot me fired, the muzzle flash lit up the night for about half a second. In that light, I saw the horse he was riding, a dark animal, big, with a scar on its left haunch. He paused. A brand scar, the iron mark of Hargrove's ranch. I know that brand. I have seen it on 100 of Hargrove's animals over the years. The horse that Cade Thorne rode the night he shot me was branded with Victor Hargrove's mark. The courtroom erupted. Judge Wainwright retired to deliberate. 3 hours, the longest 3 hours in the collective memory of Fort Benton. The Stone family sat in the front row of the gallery, holding each other's hands and waiting for the verdict that would determine whether they still had a home. Wainwright returned. He stood behind his bench and put on his spectacles and read from a document written in his precise, angular hand. The court finds that the deed presented by Mr. Victor Hargrove is not authentic. The weight of evidence, including the federal mining claims filed by Thomas Ashford in 1855, the handwriting analysis demonstrating the use of anachronistic writing instruments, the testimony of neighboring landowners establishing a pattern of intimidation and fraudulent land acquisition, and the identification of a horse bearing Hargrove's brand at the scene of an armed assault collectively and individually support the conclusion that this document was fabricated for the purpose of unlawfully seizing land belonging to the Stone family. He looked up from his document. His eyes found Hargrove across the courtroom. The claim is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the court refers all matters pertaining to the armed assault on the Stone Ranch, the beating of citizens, the poisoning of livestock, the destruction of property, and the suspected involvement of Mr. Hargrove in additional criminal activities, including the murder of Duncan Stone, to the territorial marshal for immediate investigation. The courtroom detonated. Cheers and applause and the sound of 12 ranch families releasing years of fear in a single collective exhalation. Verity grabbed Garrett's hand and held it so tight her knuckles went white. Harriet wept. Beckett let out a war cry that was entirely inadvisable for a man with a healing bullet wound. Tucker lifted Wesley Crane completely off the ground with one arm. In the weeks that followed, the territorial marshal conducted his investigation. Cade Thorne, facing charges for the assault and the shooting of Beckett, made a calculation about his own survival that was as cold and precise as every other calculation he had ever made. He turned state's evidence. His testimony confirmed what the Stone brothers had believed for 10 years but could never prove. Victor Hargrove had ordered the murder of Duncan Stone. The killing had been carried out by a drifter hired through intermediaries paid in cash and instructed to make it look like a robbery. The murder was not about money. It was about land. It was about a man who had been told no and could not accept it. Victor Hargrove was arrested on a Tuesday morning in May. His ranch was seized to pay damages to the families he had terrorized. His hired men scattered, and the shadow that had hung over the Bitterroot Valley for 15 years was lifted permanently. On a spring morning shortly after the arrest, the three Stone brothers walked together to a rise above the ranch where a simple wooden cross marked their father's grave. The Bitterroot Mountains stood behind them, still white with snow at the summits, the valleys below just beginning to green with the first growth of the season. A hawk circled in a sky so blue it seemed to hum. Garrett spoke first. "We got him, Pa." His voice was thick. "It took 10 years, but we got him. You can rest now." Beckett knelt and placed his hand on the cross, the scarred hand that had held a torch against a grizzly bear and a rifle against armed men, in an old woman's trembling fingers during a wedding ceremony. He said nothing. Some things go deeper than words. Down past language, past gesture, into the place where a son's love for a murdered father lives forever unchanged by time, uneroded by grief. Tucker knelt beside his brother and cleared the weeds that had grown around the grave. The youngest brother, the gentle one. The poet who had found his father's body at 17 and had been trying to build beautiful, lasting things in an impermanent world ever since. He was crying. He was not ashamed of it. A man who writes poetry about mountains at dawn and carves wooden horses by lantern light is not a man who hides his tears. He is a man who understands that tears and beauty come from the same source. Verity stood a few steps back, giving them their moment, but she was there, present, part of the family that Duncan Stone had started and that his sons had defended, and that she, through a chain of events that began with a newspaper advertisement and a stagecoach ticket, had helped to say, built this with our own hands, all of them, across decades, across death. The rancher and the scholar and the seamstress and the school teacher and three brothers who refused to let the darkness win. The year turned toward warmth and light. With Hargrove gone and the legal threat extinguished, the Stone Ranch entered a season of peace that none of them had ever known. The cattle thrived on spring grass. The pastures erupted in wildflowers so dense and colorful that the whole valley looked like someone had emptied a paint box across the landscape. Tucker repaired the barn wall that the grizzly had broken through. Beckett's shoulder healed, leaving a scar he wore with the particular pride of a man who earned it protecting something worth protecting. In May, Verity told Garrett she was carrying their child. She told him on the porch at sunset, which had become their place, the spot where every important conversation in their marriage seemed to find its setting. The sky was staging a performance of color so excessive it would have seemed implausible in a painting. Orange and pink and purple and gold layered and blended and constantly changing. "Are you certain?" Garrett asked, and his voice cracked on the second word in a woe that would have been embarrassing under any other circumstances. "As certain as a woman can be," Verity said. "All the signs are there." Garrett pulled her close with a tenderness so fierce it contained its own contradiction, holding her as if she were simultaneously the most fragile and the most powerful thing he had ever touched. "I did not expect you, but I am not letting you go." Harriet received the news with a joy that took 10 years off her face. She was at her sewing machine within the hour, planning garments so small they seemed designed for dolls rather than humans. In March of 1880, Verity went into labor. Cordelia Dawson arrived to assist, bringing her 30 years of frontier experience and her unshakable calm. Harriet held Verity's hand through the long hours while the three Stone brothers paced the front porch like enormous, heavily armed, expectant fathers. The birth was difficult, harder than anyone expected. Garrett, listening to Verity's cries through the walls, felt a helplessness more profound than anything he had ever known. He could not fight this. He could not build anything or shoot anything or ride through a storm. He could only wait. But Verity did what she had always done when the world turned dark. She fought. She endured. She refused to let anything die on her watch. The baby's cry split the March air like a bell ringing in a new age. "A boy," Cordelia announced. "Healthy and strong, with lungs that could call cattle from the next county." They named him Duncan Thomas Stone, after both their fathers. The rancher who was murdered for his land and the scholar who filed mining claims on that same land a decade before the rancher ever saw it. Two men who never met, connected across time and death by the child of one's granddaughter and the other's son. They called the baby Gus. He had his mother's blue eyes and his father's jaw. And he was the first Stone born on this ranch since Tucker 27 years before. The years that followed were kind, not easy because frontier life never offered ease as part of its bargain, but rich with the particular blessings that come to people who have earned their happiness through sacrifice and struggle and the refusal to surrender. Beckett fell in love with Jessamine Cole, a widow of 30, with steady brown eyes and dry humor that could cut through pretense like a blade through paper. Their courtship was cautious in the way of two burned people who did not trust the warmth of a new fire. They circled each other for months, talked about horses and weather and the price of beef, argued about politics and the proper way to break a colt. Gradually, so gradually, neither could identify when it began. The talking became the thing they most looked forward to in any given day. They married and built a house a quarter-mile from the main ranch. Tucker did not marry, but he was never lonely. He became the beloved uncle to every child on the ranch. His poetry, which he had written in secret since boyhood, was eventually published after Verity discovered his manuscripts hidden in the barn and refused to let him hide his gift any longer. A Helena newspaper called him the Whitman of the West. Verity opened a school. Tucker built it for her, small but beautiful, with large windows and bookshelves along every wall. Her father's belief that knowledge was the only force powerful enough to change a person's circumstances lived on in every child who sat at those desks. Harriet Ashford passed in her sleep on a spring night when the cottonwoods were in bloom and the air through the open window was sweet with their scent. She was 71 years old. Her sewing was still in her lap. Her face was peaceful. The heart that doctors in Philadelphia had predicted would kill her within a year had carried her through 8 more years of mountain life. 8 years of sewing and grandchildren, and the deep contentment of a woman who had found at the end of a very long road exactly the place where she was meant to be. They buried her on the rise above the ranch beside Duncan Stone's grave, where the view of the Bitterroot Mountains was most spectacular. Tucker carved the headstone himself, spending 3 weeks on a piece of granite that he shaped and polished and lettered with the care of a man creating something that would need to last forever. Harriet Ashford, beloved mother and grandmother, she came west and found home. At the funeral, Verity spoke through her tears. She got to start over. She got to build a new life in a place that gave her purpose and family and the clean air that the doctor said she needed. She brought us here, all of us, even though she did not fully understand what she was carrying in that old trunk. The papers that saved this ranch, the courage that saved this family. Verity paused. Her voice broke then, steadied. My mother crossed 2,000 miles on a failing heart because she believed her daughter deserved a chance at happiness. And she was right. She was right about everything. Beckett stood at the graveside and wept openly. The fierce middle brother who had been the last to accept Harriet and the one who loved her most fiercely. Jessamine held his arm, and the sound of his grief echoed across the valley like something ancient being released. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Verity back to Eagles Peak. They were older. His dark chestnut hair was heavily streaked with gray. Her honey blonde had lightened, and there were lines around her blue eyes that mapped 2 decades of laughter and worry, and the particular weather of a life lived fully. Her hands bore calluses from years of ranch work and chalk dust from years of teaching. His hands were scarred from rope and wire and the 1,000 daily abrasions of a rancher's existence. But when they looked at each other, they saw everything: the stagecoach in the dusty street, the 3 brothers on the porch, the foaling mare in the thunderstorm, the riding lessons in the chess games, and the reading aloud by lamplight. The blizzard in the bear and the gunfire in the dark, the courtroom and the verdict and the baby's cry, the garden and the schoolhouse and the sewing machine, and 20 years of sunsets that still took their breath away. I would do it all again, Verity said, sitting on the same flat rock where Garrett had proposed. Every hard moment, every frightening night, every time I fell off that horse. Even the part where you found 3 mountain men instead of 1, Garrett asked, and the smile that crossed his weathered face was the same one that had first made her heart beat faster 20 years ago. Especially that part, Verity said, because that is when I knew who you truly were. Not from letters, not from promises made at a distance, but from what you did when everything went sideways. You chose kindness. You said, our home has room for both. That is when I started falling in love with you, Garrett Stone. That very first day. He pulled her close. They sat together and watched the sun perform its nightly miracle over the Bitterroot Peaks. Below them, the ranch spread out in golden light, cattle in the pastures, smoke from the chimney where Gus was helping prepare dinner, Beckett's house visible on the next rise, Tucker's workshop sending up wood shavings that caught the evening light like tiny golden birds. Our home has room for both, Garrett said softly. Best words I ever spoke. Best words anyone ever spoke, Verity corrected, and she kissed him as the sky turned gold. Somewhere in the house, a grandchild was singing a song that Tucker had taught him, something about mountains and home and the people who build things that last. The melody drifted through the open windows and out across the porch and into the morning air, where it mixed with the wind and the bird's song and the eternal silence of the peaks becoming part of the valley itself. Part of the story that the land would remember long after the people who lived it were gone, and neither Garrett nor Verity Stone would have had it any other way.